Welcome back to Acid Horizon. This is Craig here. Before we get into today's discussion, I want to flag an upcoming course at the Acid Horizon Research Commons. This February, Adam C. Jones of the Acid Horizon podcast is teaching Cause, Category, and Command, an introduction to Kant's first and second critiques, a 4-week seminar for anyone who's been curious about Kant but never quite knew where to start, or for those looking to refresh and sharpen their understanding of Kant. I also want to note that this week we are also beginning our The Logic of Sense reading group. And we have a Patreon-only episode dropping this Thursday or Friday featuring a conversation between myself and Devin Garay of the Moral Minority podcast. If you'd like to join the reading group or get access to bonus episodes like the one coming up, please subscribe and sustain us on Patreon. Links are in the show notes. Today's episode features Ciara Cremin on her new book, The Spectral Woman. She joins Adam to discuss femininity, psychoanalysis, and the political stakes of gender abolition. Okay, let's get into it.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. As we can tell from the march of capitalist and increasingly fascist modes of operation across the so-called developed West, we can see that one thing is true about the murderous forces that we are witnessing, that they have as much of a hatred for femininity as they do for communism. Our discussion today will discuss the ways in which these two hatreds are very much based on a similar structure, if not indeed the same thing. Because today we're going to be talking with Ciara Cremin about her latest book, The Spectral Woman, Transfemininity and the Abolition of Gender. And I'm glad to say she joins me on the show today. Ciara, welcome to the show.
Hello, Adam. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this discussion.
So this time, this book, The Spectral Woman, its core concept is that of femininity. And not only femininity in the sense that it's being sort of crudely reduced to a biological notion of the female, but as an unconscious function, as something that's immanent to language as it relates to the unconscious and is, simply not reducible either to a binary conception of gender nor to the biological. How is it that you approach the concept of femininity in this book that allows you to approach it in this particularly unconscious, psychoanalytic, and eventually sort of communist way?
Yeah, I think there are different ways of thinking of the feminine, obviously, and I bring them into productive tension. And if I can just start with the most obvious in terms of representation, then we associate femininity typically with, certain styles and certain effects and so forth. There's the negative of femininity of symbolizing weakness, subordination, in psychoanalytic terms, castration. And then there's the positive of the feminine, which would be sort of capacity for love, tenderness, kindness, care, all of those things which you'd want to encourage in a child, so that because these are qualities that are essential to life. But in a society that valorizes the masculine, we get into this sort of weird situation where those very traits, and I'm sort of referring to bell hooks in Will to Change, have to be drummed out of males. There's a psychic mutilation, as she puts it, which does irreparable damage to the psyche and to society as well. And meanwhile, for many girls and women who are kind of have femininity forced upon them, it places them in a subordinate position, vulnerable to discrimination, misogyny, sexism, and so forth, and often sort of results in lack of self-esteem, difference to the man, and so on. And it's interesting when you think of femininity in these ways, because there's both a positive and a negative side to it. The negative being weakness, vulnerability, subordination, all of which affects us negatively in an androcentric society. But then the positive side of it, tenderness, kindness, care, love, etc., these are qualities which you could say of a communistic society. A communistic society cannot survive if subjects are self-interested, aggressive, ego-oriented, sort of need to dominate and control. So we can crudely posit then the masculine as capitalist and the feminine as communist. But there's another dimension to that as well, which is how the feminine exceeds representation. And one of the kind of things I say in the book, and it's a provocation, but I think it can be defended. Good provocations can be defended, is that there's only one gender effectively, and that's the masculine gender. All else is other. And the masculine, of course, cannot exist without feminine. It has to, in a sense, invent the feminine and name, shame, and subject that otherness to subordination. And in that respect, we can then sort of describe the feminine as everything that exceeds the masculine. So all forms of expression that are then subsequently gendered or identified as having a gender. It can be trans, feminine, non-binary, third gender, and so forth. They all come under these sort of labels, which then negatively impinge on our lives and our becomings and so forth. If I take the example of unisex clothing, unisex implies universality, but unisex clothing, as I think we all recognize, is clothes that men can wear. So the universal is masculine, and the exception that cannot be represented is the feminine. And the feminine, in that sense, femininity is not neutral. Femininity is categorically not neutral. And in that respect, and this is, I think, where feminists have missed out. They've rightly pointed out the disadvantages femininity places women in, but actually haven't recognized that femininity is also a force that is a threat to the masculine order, and is what is correctly feared. Because I think it's through the feminine that we can break down that order and ultimately abolish gender.
And I find it really interesting as well in terms of this unrepresentability, which you frame through the work of Jacques Lacan. And one of the things, just thinking about as you're talking about it, it's almost not to subordinate this theory to a man, but I just feel like the shadow of Bataille's shadow, because the thing that Bataille never really talks about is the feminine. Next to no way at all, and yet he's always about this excess, but there's this giant gaping void, and not the void he thinks it is around this concept.
Well, this is a really important point, I think, because when you read a lot of sympathetic texts around sort of their kind of critique of phallic sexuality, of desire as acquisitive and so forth. And proposing alternatives, it's never really placed in these terms, in terms of what I would refer to as the dialectic of the masculine and the feminine, and the feminine is the force of liberation. And I sometimes think that that's because the majority of people who are doing these sort of theories are men, and they've never encountered the feminine as and experienced that liberatory force, which I think is a specific thing that trans women encounter, because they've been both in the masculine mode and also undergoing a transition, which brings them into a productive tension with the feminine, both as that force that exceeds representation and in how they are represented or seen in the world as other.
Mm. And in terms of the excess of representation here, there's almost like a discussion in the book of sort of like the means of representation, or a hegemonic form of representation. And this comes into your concept of andro-realism, which you sort of say is sort of a little bit based on sort of the capitalist realism in terms of its function of delimiting the horizons of possibility for thought and being. But whereas capitalist realism as a concept is mostly about the imagination, andro-realism is about a certain kind of hegemony or monopoly about the way that, say, the psychic economy of life or the unconscious is structured. Can we get into this concept of andro-realism? Because I think this also goes a way to explain not only sort of the provocation, but why the provocation is indeed so provoking.
Yeah. No, actually, let's go back to Thatcher and there's no alternative to capital, Tina, and this is obviously what Mark Fisher was critiquing. In the what is the primary reason why there's no alternative? And it actually relates to andro-realism, because the problem is that we're selfish, self-interested individuals, and communism is therefore incompatible because it relies on sacrifice, communal activity, love of another, and so forth. And in a way, that's the strongest defense of what Fisher calls capitalist realism, because actually, when you look around you, there's plenty of evidence that people are extremely aggressive, extremely self-interested, selfish, and so forth. And in fact, through class history, there are countless examples of that. There's also the counterpoint, and this is maybe where the feminine comes in, of people, we're social beings, we care for others, we come to one another's aid, even if it's not in our immediate interest, people rising up against the genocide in Palestine, etc., around the world, and many examples that counter that. But nonetheless, that dimension, that aggressive dimension, is one that a lot of people ideologically seem wedded to, not just the usual suspects, but also on the left, amongst critical theorists and so forth. And Boyd is the obvious example in Civilizationist Discontent, and he says nothing such variance to human nature to love one's neighbor. But then even like late on in his Frederick Jameson in American Utopia said, even in the perfect world, can anyone seriously consider that we wouldn't be motivated by envy and want to deprive the other of their jouissance, of their enjoyment? And that would be sort of Andro-realism in that sense. There's no alternative to an aggressive, self-interested subjectivity. And I think we're all, through the effects of gendering and living and growing up in a capitalist society, none of us are purely feminine. We're all, I think, to some extent susceptible and interpolated a kind of centrism, which affects us in many different ways. But I don't think we can ever fully overcome that in a capitalist society, because capitalism relies on that. But coming back to this point around the inconceivability that we could ever be anything else other than what Lacan calls phallic in our sexuality and masculine sexuality, and that we could have a sexuality that is not object-oriented in that way, always striving for something that can never be attained and symbolic of power, status, and so forth. And I think that to conceive of an alternative is essential, because not only can we see strains of that in our society and how the subject themselves can undergo changes that can undo progressively the psychic damage that has been done, as Bell Hooks puts it, in respect to masculinity. And I suggest here maybe a trans subjects to some extent. But if we are to sort of, if there is a horizon of communism here, a communistic society that we want to fight for, and we think is plausible, I don't see how communism is plausible with a masculine subject. There is a period, what I would call feminine communism, in which the masculine subject withers away, and then we become all feminine. The end of a phallic sexuality altogether, and the end of gender in that sense. Because otherwise, we're going to perpetually need the repressive apparatuses to hold those aggressive tendencies in check, which then always means we're subject to corruption and so forth. And likewise, in movements and parties for liberation, there is a problem in that certain, it's like in capitalism in general, those who are most aggressive, most ruthless, most self-interested are in a stronger position to rise up to the top of corporate hierarchies and of party machineries, trade unions, and so forth. And in the case of the left, their activity, their actions are clothed in righteous indignation against injustices, but oftentimes I think it's ego motivated, and it's about status, power, and so forth. And I think it's important then to separate the two out and purge society, purge these movements of those types who are a danger to liberation, to emancipatory politics. So to negate androcentrism, andro-realism is to propose that another subject is possible, a feminine libidinal economy is possible.
this is a very good follow-up from our previous episode, which was on the exactly this happening in leftist movements.
Okay.
Previous episode was on the Comrade Delta scandal and the SWP, and how the masculinization and sort of the various kinds of labor relations that are upheld in the arrangement of that party led to sexual violence against women in that. So it's a very good theoretical correlate. I just wanted to point that out because it does speak to actually a sort of an ongoing conversation on this show. And in terms of the critique of andro-realism, there's actually a part in the book I found really funny, which is your critique of Jameson when he talks about, that he floats this idea that what if we all join the army in the States because they have free healthcare, it's relatively more egalitarian, they have a kind of internal rule of law. And then you sort of point out that, well, how is everyone joining the US military any more out there than everyone embracing their femininity? Like this kind of the andro-realist paradigm at work, where it's like everyone should go join the army and become, like this macho GI. Everyone, it's easier to imagine the abolition of capitalism than it is to imagine the abolition of GI Joe in this kind of framing here. And this is what I want to bring up because this is one of my sort of favorite parts of the book, to be honest, in that terms of that criticism.
Well, it's interesting in respect of people like Jameson, and we could cite examples like Slavoj Žižek, for instance, who their positions seem to reflect their own investments in masculine domination, their own unconscious androcentrism and fear of the feminine, because that's predicated on the fear of the feminine. And so there's no development in the thinking that takes them to these places, because I think it is a challenge to their own sense of self. And this is a problem amongst leftists and critical theorists generally, is that we're good at critiquing others, but we lack that self-critique, that self-analysis, the capacity to recognize the stupidity, the irony, and so forth of what we say and do sometimes. And one of the things in the book, there is a element of the book of self-critique, self-deprivation, of bringing some sort of humor to bear into it, to give it a lightness, to challenge that kind of self-seriousness and very masculine critical theory that predominates.
Yeah, the self
and just want to say, as you say, with the Socialist Worker Party, absolutely emblematic of what I'm challenging.
Yeah, in regards to the certain contemporary Hegelians, ironically, the self-consciousness epidemic has not hit them, or if it does, it seems to only do so too late, to put it in Hegel's terms. I just wanted to expand as well on this link between the feminine economy of the unconscious and communism, because I say in my notes that could we expand upon this proletarian role of the feminine, but in your analysis could equally be the feminine role of the proletarian. And in terms of this subjugated role in sort of the repressive economy of psychic life, the repressive economy of social reproduction, your argument is that this structural role that femininity has is the one that gives it a power of negation, of the possibility of negating this order and overcoming it in what we would call communism. And it particularly reaches its heights in the trans feminine position for this idea of what you call trans negativity, which is itself a negativity that is premised on the being of a subject that is on this excessive and unrepresentable femininity.
Yeah. So where would I begin with this one? So maybe sort of we take the idea of gender dysphoria, which we associate with trans people, and it's a medicalized term which involves then procedures to become true to one's orientation. I think is a basic point that everybody is gender dysphoric. Gender is something that is imposed upon everybody, and trans people know it and act on it, and cis people, we could say, know it but disavow it. And the point I would say with the trans negativity is not to overcome that gender dysphoria, but to fully lean into it. So this is kind of play on Adorno in the critique of the culture industry, where he talks about you can be alienated in mass culture or pop culture, and you can be alienated by it. And so you might say that cis are alienated in gender and trans are alienated by it. And the point then with the trans negativity is not to positivize trans by then going into this kind of discursive attempts to justify one's position. One of the problems I've had as once I came out in this way is if ever it's called on me to say, you know, to explain what it means to be a woman, I can't do it on any grounds that I think I cannot be subject to critique. You know, whether it's to do with feelings, presentation, having always felt a certain way. There's a tendency to essentialize gender or whatever. And I think so rather than to return to some original state which didn't exist in the first place of having a gender, to reject the positivization of trans altogether and from that position of negativity, then to operationalize our own sort of modes of being that are not determined in these linguistic ways, which can only ever fail to satisfy the demands of others for an explanation of what makes us a woman. So I cannot defend the idea of being a woman, but then the upshot of this, nobody can. And that's what makes trans femininity so destabilizing, so disruptive, because it brings that to the fore. It draws attention to the fact that woman is an unstable category and cannot be pinned. And then sort of in respect then to the proletarian point, because it's a big question you ask, sorry, it's a lot, lengthy answer. So there's an analogy there. So because I think one of my things does go against the grain of a lot of queer and feminist thinking, is that I'm seeing femininity is not merely subordination, which it is under these circumstances, but also liberation, and the power of negation lies in the feminine, the negation of the masculine, but the negation of gender as such. And it's through the feminine and the feminine alone that we can return this order. So if we map that to the classic relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the bourgeoisie needs the proletariat in order then to exploit the labor power, to accumulate and so forth. But the proletariat doesn't need the bourgeoisie. In fact, it's in the material interest of the proletariat to eliminate the bourgeoisie, and by doing so, they eliminate themselves as a class. And so if we think about the masculine and feminine in those ways, the feminine has to be created as defined as another, and then subject to subordination and so forth. That the masculine is defined in terms of what it's not, the feminine. Then it's the feminine that exceeds the masculine and which threatens the masculine, which is where the masculine can be overturned, because ultimately, if the masculine incorporated the feminine, then gender no more. And to put it maybe sort of in more relatable terms, you know, like if we think about the idea of manning up, you know, like the boys' school near where I live, where it says, take courage, be a man, courage being the most masculine of traits. The one place man cannot go without negating himself is the feminine. The feminine is the ultimate act of courage. So in a certain play on this, the ultimate litmus test of being a man is becoming a woman. And the real man in that sense is a woman. And if men become women, and it's only through that then we can remove those distinctions which are so egregious to us personal and collective advancement.
Yeah, no, I think it's very well situated as well when you go on to discuss it in terms of Antigone as well. This idea that it is an ethical act of self-conscious self-creation, which I think in terms of the sacrificial element as well. You know, it is a stake. It is, you know, if you want to go into sort of the, you know, master servant dialectic, it's like, no, there's a stake in life here that isn't simply reduced to how you exist for another, in the sense of, whatever, basically where was beaten into us, where was being shown to us through various kinds of YouTube shorts or whatever, Andrew Tate or some godforsaken fascist is peddling through children's screens these days, and adult screens, actually. Let's be honest, they're probably more vulnerable to it than young people at this rate. I mean, I guess one question, actually, one thing I didn't bring up actually is why spectral? Why is it a spectral? Why is this the structure, or why is the image that of spectrality in terms of haunting, as well as this idea that it's not necessarily non-existent in terms of like vaporous, but more in the sense of a poltergeist, something that is active, something that is in the economy of psychic life, but nonetheless haunts it.
Yeah, I think I mean there is an opening riff around the spectre of communism, and that sort of, people are familiar with the opening of the Communist Manifesto. It lends itself very well to the thesis in the book if we just substitute the feminine in place of communism in more or less lines. And I think that can be demonstrated, that there is the spectre femininity that haunts the psyche, and it's that spectre that walks the world in the trans feminine figure who doesn't pass as cis, and is a disquieting presence. I mean, like a lot of transgender theory has talked about these sort of things. And of course, the spectre can't be exorcised, but you can't get rid of it. It's if you can prescribe transgender, but you can't get rid of that feeling, that fear. And this is a constant reminder of that, and the reactions against trans people and trans women in particular, which are getting more and more extreme, merely testifies to that generalized fear, and also to think about it in terms of women as well, because we all know a lot of women are deeply hostile to trans women. If you look at the gender critical feminist lines around, you can't be a woman, you've got a penis and so forth. It's inconceivable that anyone can break this, can actually exceed this masculine prescription and become other than that, and go through that process of psychic healing, as we could put it. But moreover, that the gender critical feminist is actually demanding a patriarch. I demand that you remain in your place. And this is a position, I think, of a lot of women, that they want to smash the patriarchy, but nonetheless demand a patriarch, demand that we occupy these positions, these historical positions. And I think that this trans feminine figure brings out all of these tensions, raises all of these issues, confronts people with their own sort of, with their gender as a construct, as a problematic relationship. And then we have to try and exercise that spectre so that we can actually comfort ourselves and reassure ourselves that our gender is appropriate to our being. And I think that and this is the case with things like gender dysphoria and the whole kind of medicalization of these discourses, is that it is a way then of containing that spectre, of determining it, rather than unleashing that force beyond representation as the capacity to live, breathe, flourish, articulate desire, indulge in multiple pleasures without recourse to this deeply problematic, moralizing, and oppressive order.
No, I think you bring up a really good point with the desire for a kind of patriarch in the gender critical feminist movement. I mean, a while ago we did an episode on the history of essentially where some parts of the suffragist movement moved into, like, basically everyone apart from Sylvia, whether they went to sort of nationalist fronts, or one of them moved to Australia, founded the Communist Party there, then founded the Nazi Party there. And we was looking at the history of these movements as a way of tracing the origins of gender critical feminism, quote unquote. And it is genuinely weird, especially in some of the ways that I've seen some of the big names, and because I live in Britain, I can't say these big names. The way they talk as well about trying to prevent trans men from transitioning, and the language of essentially ownership over their bodies, as if they're going to lose access to a certain quantity of, essentially feminine coded bodies for them to it is for them to essentially exploit and or enjoy. It is really. I mean, I live in the UK, so you can see why it also arises from these kinds of a lot of liberal movements as well, and a decent chunk, I'm sorry to say, of the trots, because they are obsessed with this figure of, particularly this figure of the worker as well. Man hit thing with hammer. The loser in every Ken Loach movie that isn't set in Ireland. This particular image of the masculine worker, which has been such a way of essentially fostering a kind of red brownism.
Well, the thing is, if what they seem to then want to imagine communism is, it's not a communism that I would want to fight for. If we think about what is communism to us, it's for me it's a world in which we can express ourselves in many different ways. We can indulge in multiple forms of pleasure, sensuality, playfulness, and so forth. A world of color, not of grayness, not of arduous labor. And yet you look at these trots, as you put it, and you think, it's no wonder they recruit anyone into their movement at all. We need an idea of communism that is essentially feminine, and these masculinist types, whether men or women are incapable of seemingly imagining that and conceiving of how people here and now, in degrees, are embodying that. And actually may be demonstrative that there is another world that is possible, that is imminent to life, but we need to draw out, encourage, and make part of these struggles.
Yeah, and just anything for any Trotskyist listeners, if you're a British Trotskyist listening to this, you know who I'm talking about, and if you know who I'm talking about, you know I'm not talking about you. We're talking about counterfire. Everyone else is generally quite all right. If there are any American Trotskyists, congratulations, I guess. You still have a lot to sort out, though. And in terms of the sort of communism that we would like to live in, I mean, this also comes into the femininity as an image, because if the communist imaginary is essentially tied to, not necessarily essentially tied to, inextricably linked, let's say, with a feminine imaginary, this is where I think I'm really interested in how you draw on this concept from Walter Benjamin of the dialectical image, taken away from sort of this. I think it's from the Theses on the Philosophy of History, I believe. I can't remember, but there's a way you use it in terms of making a case for sort of a latent utopian and communist dimension to images which have been coded as feminine, therefore repressed and made to fill this feminine role in a economy that is determined by the kind of masculine forms of the ego, particularly for the images of, for example, lipstick and pantyhose are two of the main images presented throughout the book. I mean, could we unpack, how are lipstick and pantyhose exemplary of the dialectical image in Walter Benjamin?
Yeah, the proletariat in pantyhose. I think that there is a certain playfulness in some of what I do, but a seriousness to it as well. And I do make fun of men. They're easy to make fun of. And in respect to actually the chapter 5 you're referring to, femininity and phantasmagoria, is probably the most fun that I had writing. And it comes back down to the idea of femininity is superficiality, decadence, and so forth. That femininity is a construct that the beauty and fashion industry have invented, and women are subordinated to, sort of made to feel a lack of self-esteem, etc. And maybe all those things. There's some truth in that, and need then of the product to as a emollient to those feelings. But what I would claim is that the beauty and fashion industry didn't invent femininity. It didn't create a desire for things we associate with femininity. It merely commodified them and sought to then gain a competitive advantage through appealing to a feminine sensibility. Because when we break it down, and this is where the kind of things like, well, I call them pantyhose here, but in the UK, sheer tights, are interesting in that respect. Because I think that is maybe the most feminine and also provocative of garments in a way. And what I mean by this is that there is nothing equivalent in the masculine wardrobe. And if you break it down and try to sort of separate it from the images associated with it, it's a sensuous fabric. It's certainly the high quality brands are pleasant to the touch. It creates a certain visual effect, which you could say is attractive to the eye, and not necessarily in the way that one might imagine from what I've just said. And in fact, if you think about it, like with feminine clothing generally and different styles and fabrics and colors and so forth, men ought logically to want to wear these clothes. Sensuous beings, we ought to be drawn to sensuous fabrics, to silk and so forth. But it's weird that men aren't. I think all men ought to be transvestites, because there's something there about these things, and pantyhose in particular, that is an anathema that men recoil against and maybe fetishize on the bodies of women, of course. And the reason for taking this particular example is that when I say to women, or women ask, why am I wearing pantyhose or whatever, I say, I really love wearing them. I think they're very sensual. And a lot of women express complete bafflement that I could get pleasure from wearing such a garment. And I think this testifies to the different ways that femininity is related to by men and women. For men to repress and repudiate any association with anything that can be contingently associated with femininity. There's no rational basis in why tights aren't worn by men. I mean, they historically have been in certain situations. But with women, it's interesting as well, because obviously these sort of garments are associated with work, with enforced dress codes, with discomfort, and also with the male gaze, the fetishization of the female body, which, because femininity is alien, erotic, a mystique to masculine ego that has does not embrace that in any way. And so you can see how that sort of plays out here. And what I think that I want to try and do is extract a kernel here. There's a sensuality that all of us as sensuous beings ought logically to be drawn to, but which we're alienated from through these gendering effects. And so that is one example of how this alienation from sensuality occurs, and how I think in the communistic side we recover our sensuality, our species-specific capacities, you could argue, in which we can experience sensual pleasures and actually indulge them without reserve, without that kind of reserve that is deeply integrated into the psyche as a consequence of these gendering effects. So that's where these sort of things come in. So in a way, let's say a trans feminine woman breaches these divides and so reveals the dialectic of femininity, both as oppression in how then people react to her, often in negative terms, but also of liberation, because it recovers the sensuality. You could even say a polymorphous perversity that is hitherto denied. And that again becomes then an image of communism, an image of a communist society where there are no such restrictions because we're not socialized in these ways. So pantyhose would be an example of that demonstrates how this gendering affects our sensual appreciation of objects. And just to put it in terms of practicality and so forth, there's nothing more dull than function. And again, in a communistic society, we wouldn't, function wouldn't be the be all and end all of dress as instrumental to labor or whatever. In a free society where we're not so restricted by our labors, then the aesthetic life would blossom, and in a sense, what I'm trying to embody here is an aestheticization that appeals to the senses and suggests that a communism is possible that is bright, colorful, and playful.
It makes me think about what is the most stereotypically comfy item of clothing for men, and it's like tracksuit bottoms, which maybe
dresses,
yeah. I mean, in terms of like the idea of it's something which is associated with exercise and sort of this function of constant motion and the acquisition of bodily mass, when that's I think the closest thing that I think in terms of, if you want to think of somebody particularly presents themselves or wants to be identified with sort of the masculine image, it is as I'm in the comfy pants that I always used to run everywhere. I don't know, go hunt a deer or something.
And you see it amongst many women who have succumbed to this. There's kind of like a moral indignation against women who embrace the feminine. I daily, practically, women come up to me and say, "I love, how you present," and they lament that they no longer present that way. They feel guilty for doing so, and there's something ridiculous about that. But then there is that other side of femininity where it is about sort of impressing boss and clients and boyfriends and so forth, and all those sort of pressures and, like I say, the male gaze, and so there is that dimension. I no doubt will be subject to those sort of gazes as well, but we can't allow ourselves to be determined in that way and to succumb to those sort of pressures by becoming like men. The recovery of that aesthetic, I think, is important to the health and vitality of society.
I mean, in terms of those images and in terms of those articles of clothing, I get one question that sort of a Marxist sort of would ask is about, in this case, how does this fit into sort of now sort of say commodity fetishism? And it seems like from your Lacanian approach, the aspect it might be, as if I sort of understand it, is not so much to abolish commodity fetishism so much as a free or liberate the fetish from the commodity to that extent.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Freudian fetish, and then there's obviously the Marxist fetish around monetary equivalence, and of course, commodity fetishism is specific to a capitalist society, and is absolutely detrimental to every aspect of human life. But fetishism is not. I mean, like, this is, where I think, and I try to this is me challenging taboos, and I think there's a certain obligation on a writer like me who is making these arguments to confess, as it were, to my own perversions, my own sort of fetishes. Because I think life is actually made more interesting and we may be more honest with ourselves if we acknowledge that we do have weird fetishes. We have irrational attachments to various activities and things and so forth. And mostly they're benign. Sometimes they're not benign. Sometimes they're incredibly destructive. But, I could say that I enjoy wearing what society terms women's clothes, big deal. I mean, lots of cis women do too. To embrace that pleasure and to fully own it, and to fully own that, I think, is itself can operate as a refusal of the societal injunction, of the superego injunction to live and be a certain way, and to embrace that perversity can actually, I think, be both liberating and challenging to norms in a society where we celebrate the idea that we're somehow sexually liberated and can do express ourselves in many different ways. And I think that is bogus, and really needs to look at how the majority of men dress, for example, to see that fairly rigid patterns of gender still obtain, despite there being more and more visibility of people like me.
Yeah, actually, when you said that we're talking about pleasure, actually, it reminded me of something I read recently by Reich, as opposed to the Fourth Reich, of course. That's just America.
the Wilhelm Reich.
The Wilhelm Reich, the short-lived over in I can't Organon, wherever it was. I think it was Connecticut. Craig went there, listeners. You can go find the episode, but he went there and then work out what state it's in. I can't remember. But something his critique of the sexual liberation, which was it was presented as, and Reich isn't being a conservative here. He wrote a book on the sexual liberation, well, one of the many books, but one of his critiques of certain kinds of presented liberal forms of sexual liberation was it was a liberation that's only allows people to sort of own their own means of production to some extent. It was like, okay, for example, it's incomplete if it's, for example, just birth control. And if there's not like an aspect of pleasure about it, it just reduces it to this function of reproductive labor. And I want to ask to some extent, insofar as a feminine communism would end up doing a sort of abolition, well, it would not, it's not sort of, it would abolish gender. Would this also mean is this kind of like an anti-work praxis to some extent built into this, or a kind of a utopian horizon beyond certain ideas of work?
I think that work, in a manner of speaking, is a vital aspect of human activity, but work can be learning an instrument or many other different things. But obviously work in a capitalist society is deeply alienating and oppressive. So the kind of form of work would radically differ. And I think this is an important parallel to imagining a feminine communism, or a society in which there's no phallic sexuality, we're all feminine, is that, just as in communism, people will work and people may even enjoy some form of competitive sports. Work would take on an entirely different form. If we engage in competitive sports, our egos wouldn't be at stake. It'd be a very different way in which we engage with these things. And likewise, to imagine a society where there is no sort of phallic identitarian orientation, because in Lacan, masculine sexuality is identitarian. How can we be without names and so forth? Of course, we can't be without names and so forth. But it'll be a very different kind of phallus, a very different kind of way of engaging with work to what we currently encounter, to the extent that it can't really be properly imagined, because that is so alien to what we experience, but nonetheless a hypothetical possibility, as I kind of map out in the book. So in respect to work and so forth, I don't want to sort of go too far down the Marcusian path about work becomes pleasure and play and so forth. There's a certain romanticism about that which I'm not entirely comfortable with. But certainly, I think that, we have to conceive of a different kind of work, a different kind of subject that is entirely incompatible with who we are and what we do now. So these terms take on a radically different meaning.
No, that's fantastic. Well, Ciara, thanks again for coming on Acid Horizon. This book is out. It's out now, I believe, from our good friends over at Pluto Press. Are you working on anything else at the moment? Anything else you want to plug?
No, I since writing that, I think, what the hell do I do now? It kind of, it's a book that took a lot of energy, a lot of emotion to write. I think I've thrown everything into it and I feel exhausted. I do talk about make the call for full emasculation now in the book, and I think that maybe I can take that idea a little bit further and maybe build on that. But I'm not sure yet. I'm still thinking about it. But the Spectral Woman is the one I want to plug here.
And is it also, as I understand it, the culmination of a trilogy, right? With Man Made Woman and Future as Feminine. Is it part of a trilogy, or is it just thematically resonant?
Yeah, I think it's
trilogy,
thematically resonant. I don't think it's necessary to have read the previous two books, but I think they belong in a series in that sense. And The Spectral Woman is definitely the mature, definitive position. It's very much an intervention and position piece that I think does challenge many of the ideas that perhaps within these fields people hold to, and will hopefully resonate with anyone who reads it, because I do think it speaks to universal truths.
And folks, you can buy that from Pluto Press. We say thanks again, Ciara, for joining us, and folks, we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much.